Doncs la ponència inaugural és a càrrec de la companya Rasha Abdul Rahim. Ella és una activista palestina, defensora dels drets humans i experta en polítiques tecnològiques. És l'exdirectora executiva interina de People vs Big Tech, que és una coalició en la qual també Xnet participa, que lluita per la rendició de compte del sector tecnològic. Rasha va ser també directora d'Amnesty International en l'àmbit de tecnologies i és on va liderar iniciativa global sobre la vigilància, la intel·ligència artificial, els drets digitals i també les guerres híbrides contra la població. Rasha en aquest moment ha deixat tots els seus projectes a Europa per dedicar-se completament a la situació a Palestina. Ens connectem amb ella, crec. Hi, Rasha. Very happy to have you here. So, if you don't mind, do you have the audio also of Rasha? Can you talk? You are talking, but we are not hearing. Now yes. Now that's great. Okay, thank you very much, Rasha. So, thank you very much to be here. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your very kind introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you today. I wish I could. I have the pleasure and somewhat pressure as well to be the first speaker. And so today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the status of key EU regulations relating to tech, obviously. And I've also been asked to talk about the situation in Palestine and big tech's involvement in the Gaza genocide. So I'll try and weave those in together in somewhat of a cohesive way. And I'll just share my screen with you now so that I can begin. Let me put it in a slideshow. Can everyone see the presentation? I'll assume yes. Okay, so here's what I'm going to cover today. So I'm going to talk about the original promise of EU tech, how we were all hopeful once upon a time, and how somehow that hope is disappearing, but maybe we have some cause to be optimistic. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the big tech oligarchy and how that's affected the implementation of EU regulation. Excuse me. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the current state of play. So what's going on now in the EU tech regulation landscape. I'm going to talk about what's at stake, both in Europe and also globally. And then at the end, I'm hopefully going to end on a bit more of an optimistic note and talk about what's needed and what Europe can do to forge a better path forward. So let me start talking about some of the key regulations related to big tech accountability in the EU. So first, we have the Digital Services Act, right? So that was adopted in 2022, and it came into force to all online platforms. It started applying to them in February last year. So this aims to ensure that users have access to safe products, and it aims to protect users' fundamental rights. And it also gives EU institutions and member states the power to force big tech platforms to take down illegal content quickly, to tackle things like disinformation, and in theory, to be much more transparent about how their algorithms and moderation systems work. In addition to this, it allows for audits and serious penalties for non-compliance. This includes multi-million euro fines of up to 6% of tech companies' global annual turnover. So, in terms of enforcement, as of the present day, the EU hasn't yet imposed fines under the Digital Services Act, although there are some investigations underway and there are formal charges that are anticipated. And just a few days ago, Meta and TikTok were found to be in breach of the DSA. So in this case, Facebook and Instagram were found to have failed to adequately moderate illegal content on their platforms, and they were also accused of lacking proper systems for users to report illegal content. So the Commission's preparing to issue formal charges now. And similarly for TikTok, it's been found of breaching transparency rules under the DSA, including using deceptive interface and sort of not doing proper content flagging, and also restricting the access that researchers should have to platform data. So, you know, in some ways, this highlights that, you know, there is a commitment there from the EU to enforce the DSA and to hold big tech platforms accountable. But as I'll discuss now when I'm talking about the Digital Markets Act, the DMA, it could be doing much, much more. So the DMA was adopted also in 2022, came into force in 2023, and the DMA is all about fair competition and tackling the enormous market power and dominance of big tech companies. And it targets so-called gatekeepers, like major online platforms, and the aim is to stop them from abusing their market dominance.
Rasha, just a second,
Yeah.
because I forgot to say that there is translation. So,
Sorry.
no, sorry, it's my fault. La traducció, aquí traduïm totes les llengües en castellà, però hi ha traducció del català a l'anglès i de l'anglès al català amb auriculars per si algú ho necessita. Sorry, you can continue. Thank you.
No problem. And I will speak more slowly as well for the translators. So back to the Digital Markets Act. So it's all about, so it bans things like self-preferencing. It enforces things like interoperability. And the aim is to open the door for smaller players in the market to compete. Now, in terms of enforcement, there have been some fines that have been issued. So in April, Apple was fined 500 million euros for violating rules over its App Store restrictions, which basically stopped developers from promoting alternative distribution channels within their apps or linking out to web pages where, you know, customers could pay or subscribe for their services. And Meta was fined 200 million euros for forcing Facebook and Instagram users to either pay a subscription fee to remove ads or to consent to having their personal data used. So it's the pay and consent model that was introduced in the EU, and that will also be introduced in the UK as well. And however, this isn't enough because companies really treat you know, these multi-million euro fines, you know, just as the cost of doing business. And so they don't tend to change their behavior. And, you know, any sort of behavioral changes that they are asked to make, they don't respect. They tend to ignore them. And so what the Commission, in my opinion, has failed to do is go beyond fines and enforce meaningful and much needed structural reforms. And it had a huge opportunity to do this year with the Google ad tech case that was before the Commission. So for people who are not aware, the Commission was looking at Google's ad tech business and trying to ascertain whether or not it you know, it was monopolizing the market. There was a similar case in the US where it was ruled that yes, indeed, Google was abusing its power in the ad tech business. But what did the Commission do? It issued another fine, and really this was a once in a generation opportunity to dismantle Google's advertising monopoly, which, you know, destroys the news media, it rips off consumers, and, you know, it was ruled, as I say, illegal in the US, in a landmark US judgment. Although, unfortunately, the US, the Department of Justice, the courts stopped short of breaking up Google as well in the US, sadly. And then there's the AI Act. This is the newer legislation, and that came into being last year. And the way that the AI Act works is it doesn't regulate AI in the abstract, but rather it regulates the uses of AI. So it talks about high-risk contexts like employment, credit, or essential public services, which all sort of face strict requirements. For generative AI, there are certain transparency standards that have to be met. There's also rules around the limits on the use of biometric identification. And in terms of enforcement, it's too early. The Commission has said that all of the deadlines in relation to the AI Act still stand. So a lot of its substantive provisions will start to apply next year. There are already some provisions that already apply. There's going to be heavy lobbying around public security, and there will be a push for more exemptions around the use of biometric surveillance. We're already seeing that enforcement capacity is limited, especially at national authority level, and we're seeing a huge push again from big tech companies who want to who want codes of conduct, right? Like non-binding codes of conduct, because they don't want to respect the law in many cases. So how did we get here? As you all will know, there's been a huge shift to the right and the far right in Europe in general, and also in the European Parliament. But even before that, big tech companies had legions of lobbyists who were advancing their agenda in EU and global actually regulatory spaces. So they already had a huge advantage and were hugely powerful. But now they're backed by President Trump and in general, a US administration which is very heavily supporting and leveraging big tech for its own interests. And so now that they're backed by President Trump, who's pledged to stand up to countries that, quote, attack them, they're kind of full on trying to undermine EU regulations. So just a few examples. So under Trump and US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the US administration has labeled the DSA as a form of Orwellian censorship, which is wholly untrue. The Republican-led House Judiciary Committee, which is chaired by Jim Jordan, has led a major offensive against the DSA. They've issued subpoenas to tech companies to gather information about the DSA. They issued a 145-page report accusing the EU of creating a global censorship regime that infringes on American speech. They've attacked the DSA through letters and public statements. They led a congressional delegation overseas to speak out against the DSA. The chairman of the US Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, Andrew Ferguson, sent letters to 13 major US tech platforms, including Apple, Meta, Google, Microsoft, and others, Amazon, warning them not to weaken US users' security or privacy by applying European regulation, including the DSA. And of course, they've issued threats of tariffs and, in a sort of unprecedented way, visa restrictions on EU or member state officials who are responsible for implementing the DSA. So there's huge transatlantic pressure and almost bullying to kind of stop the EU from enforcing EU regulation. So what has this in turn done? Well, unfortunately, it's now resulted in a drive towards deregulation within the EU. So the mood in Brussels has turned really decisively against regulation, and there's a strong push for this idea of European competitiveness, European tech sovereignty, and calls to roll back the so-called red tape, which is preventing European businesses from thriving. And when Ursula von der Leyen took office for the second time at the end of 2024, she announced that her biggest focus this time would be an unprecedented simplification effort, throughout the next sort of 5 years. So, and what simplification really means is deregulation. So what does this mean in practice? What this means is that the EU's 27 commissioners have to cut laws in their policy areas, in some cases by up to 35%. And they're not looking really at the quality of the laws, they're looking at the quantity, the volume of the laws. And what that will mean is that they will want to make the laws easy for companies to follow, rather than focusing on the need to protect people's rights. And so this kind of simplification, deregulation drive has been sort of framed around 4 core principles. One is around competitiveness. So here we see again this usual decades-long dichotomy of innovation versus regulation, which we all know is a false dichotomy. What's driving this is, a desire to strengthen EU companies' hand in the global market and really prioritize business interests above all else. But there are problems with this approach, which is that smartly designed regulations are supposed to guide innovation towards reducing harm and risk. The regulations are not sort of stifling innovation; they're guiding it. And also looking at this, false dichotomy is a very simplistic way of assessing the problem, and in many ways, it's misdiagnosing the problem. There are, and it overlooks kind of deeper reasons why innovation in Europe can be difficult. For example, there's persistent underfunding in private and venture capital in Europe. There are siloed and fragmented markets. There's reliance on non-EU infrastructures. There are lots of other ways why Europe has fallen behind in terms of sort of competition. And in addition to this, there is, there is a failure to enforce structural remedies against big tech companies, which would open up the market and allow smaller companies to be able to actually compete. So there is a fundamental market failure there. Then there's this notion of stress testing. So again, von der Leyen, when she announced her plans, she announced that she'd be stress testing the entire EU regulatory landscape to try and sort of stop any overlaps or contradictions. So in other words, all EU laws will have to be scrutinized to figure out how to make it simpler for companies. And so this is an incredibly risky strategy, because it means that, hard-fought rights like the GDPR or other rights sort of connected to labor or chemical safety or the environment, could be destroyed in this process. And then, of course, I already mentioned simplification. And the one of the key risks with this is that trade bodies representing the biggest and most powerful companies are dominating this discussion. In theory, there's no issue with making compliance easier for small businesses and streamlining reporting, reducing duplication, etc. But overhauling, the rules wholesale is a huge problem. And instead of focusing just on deregulation, Europe should be making sure that the voices of smaller businesses and, of course, civil society especially are heard in policy making. And then finally, it's everyone's talking about omnibus in Europe at the moment. So this is a proposal that aims to change several EU laws in one go. And Henna Verkunen, the commissioner who's sort of in charge of the big tech portfolio, has announced that there will be a whole process to simplify single market legislation. And so there'll be a review essentially of the AI Act, the GDPR, which has already started, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act. And so that's, these foundational laws that are designed to hold big tech companies to account and to also protect data privacy within Europe. And so, I'll talk more about this towards the end of my presentation, but, it's clear that deregulation alone is not going to make Europe more competitive. In fact, it could more likely have the opposite effect. by reinforcing the dominance of big tech platforms, while also undermining Europe's long-standing values on data protection, on accountability, and trust. So, what's at stake? So, a lot, basically. Sorry, I'm just going to have a sip of water. So, the world is facing a polycrisis. Authoritarianism is rising, economic and energy crises are worsening, climate change is straining global resources. And as these crises grow, our ability to address them is weakening. That we can see that there are democracies around the world that are being undermined by a broken information system that amplifies extremism, fuels disinformation, and erodes trust in institutions at a time when we need that trust the most, and we need those institutions the most. And the consequences are extremely severe. Fact-based discourse and progressive ideas struggle to compete. The public sphere is increasingly shaped by those who exploit digital infrastructure for power and profit. And this not only threatens democracy, but it also blocks progress on critical issues like climate action, gender equality, racial equality, and other very important issues. And in terms of, for EU citizens, this is at stake. Long fought and hard won fundamental rights are at serious risk right now. Platforms could continue to do very sort of opaque content moderation, allow the spread of mis and disinformation, use sort of manipulative dark patterns. Thinking about AI, non-enforcement could mean very sort of invasive mass surveillance technologies that incorporate biometrics, could operate without safeguards, which could have also discriminatory or privacy invasive sort of consequences. And then obviously with thinking about market dominance, not enforcing EU regulations means that gatekeepers will maintain their dominance, which then in turn limits user choice, competition, interoperability, etc., etc. And then linked to that, of course, there's a huge impact on democracy and public trust. With misinformation and algorithmic bias and opaque AI decisions could undermine public debate and election integrity. We saw a few days ago, just in Ireland, that there was an fake AI video of the now president saying, claiming that she'd pulled out of the election. This is really, really dangerous stuff. And citizens will then likely lose trust in digital platforms and regulators. And then for market competition, there's huge implications. With dominant platforms will continue to block competitors or set unfair fees, or refuse interoperability. And then innovation slows because monopolistic power sort of disincentivizes new entrants into the market. And then there's implications for Europe's sort of status and reputation as a regulator, a credible regulator on the global stage. Other countries may ignore EU norms if enforcement is inconsistent, and companies may also calculate that actually it's cheaper to not comply than actually comply. We'll take the fines, give us fines, and that then erodes the deterrent effect of the fines. But beyond Europe, this also has implications. We really see now, and I think this is probably the first time in a long time I felt this, that big tech companies are very, very emboldened right now. Even from the beginning of the year, with Mark Zuckerberg sort of announcing that he's scrapping fact checkers and opening the door for abuse against LGBTQI communities and migrants on platforms. It's very brazen sort of displays of corporate power, and that's happening all around the world. And so, one example is, of course, when we look at big tech companies' role in the Gaza genocide. And history's shown that the more powerful states and sort of companies and other entities get, and the more they're allowed to kind of act with impunity, the more egregious their actions become. And this is something that we've seen in the Gaza genocide. So it's what the Gaza genocide has really revealed is a kind of a broader structural alignment between big tech companies and state power. And as you can see on the screen, this is just a sort of a snapshot. Every single big tech company and companies that we would not class as big tech, like IBM and Oracle and Palantir, have played a major role in the Gaza genocide. From Google providing cloud services and amplifying propaganda with Netanyahu's office, to Meta systematic censorship of Palestinian voices and content online, and allowing the spread of genocidal speech to spread on its platforms, with cloud services sort of revolutionizing the way in which the genocide has been implemented on a large scale never seen before. We can see what happens when companies are left to act with impunity for decades. So enforcement of regulation on big tech companies has implications beyond Europe, and in making sure that Europe stands strong and enforces the law would send a much needed message to big tech companies that they're not above the law and that they will be held accountable. So what should Europe be doing? Obviously, enforcing the law, rather than dismantling existing protections in pursuit of competitiveness. Europe needs to double down on its regulatory trajectory, which is grounded in democratic values and consumer rights, in fair market conditions, in environmental rights. And this is backed up by polling. So when I was at People versus Big Tech, we commissioned a poll to sort of gauge public attitudes towards big tech and big tech accountability. And according to a survey that we conducted by YouGov, that we commissioned YouGov to do in France, Germany, and Spain, 2/3 of people in those countries believe that Europe needs to enforce laws on big tech companies, even if this damages relations with Trump. So, and sorry, just to explain the picture on the screen, excuse me, I've spoken to a lot of people within big tech companies, senior people especially, and they do really fear EU regulation. If there's one thing that they fear, it's not public campaigns or boycott campaigns or civil society organizations. It's they listen to, they watch very carefully what's happening in the EU in terms of regulation, and they are scared of enforcement. And if they weren't, they wouldn't spend millions and millions of dollars every year on corporate lobbying activities. So, that is a very strong lever that the European Union has. The second thing to do is to break up and also break open. So, as I alluded to a bit earlier in the presentation, we just cannot address big tech's harms without first confronting its power. There's a handful of tech giants that have concentrated power over our core digital infrastructure, including search engines, social media, app stores, and cloud. Only, was it last week or the week before, Amazon's AWS service collapsed and then affected lots and lots of core infrastructures in governments and in businesses. So it's dangerous to have such a huge dependence on big tech companies and a handful of big tech companies, and then the companies' unchecked power enables them to abuse people's rights and to exploit smaller businesses and to also crush competitors. So forcing these big tech giants to sell off parts of their business will help sort of curb conflicts of interest and level the playing field and make it sort of easier for smaller company to enter the market and also hold these big tech companies accountable for their growing societal harms. So, you know, really enforcing structural remedies will lead to hopefully a freer and fairer internet. And so the European Union really has to try and resist these threats from big tech and the Trump administration and stand firm in upholding EU law, which, given the state of geopolitics, is extremely difficult. I'm not pretending that it's something easy to do when there are so many other forces at play, but not doing it has far greater risks than actually bowing down. And again, this is backed up by polling. So the same poll that we did, roughly twice as many people polled believe that the EU should break up big tech companies compared to those who believe that the EU should not. So again, huge numbers of people think that big tech companies have grown too powerful. And at the same time, when we talk about break up, it's very important that we also talk about breaking open. So what does this mean? This means committing significant investment towards public digital infrastructure, which is based on free and open source software and the digital commons. Using public procurement as a lever to encourage sort of the adoption and the scaling of alternatives that are based on that have interoperability as a core principle. And of course, putting in place strong human rights safeguards and accountable governance frameworks, including over digital public infrastructure. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this because I know it's going to be covered later. And then third is building thoughtfully. So Europe is absolutely convinced that it can catch up to big tech companies, and I think there's a real danger in that, in sort of doing what the big tech companies did, thinking about Meta's tagline, move fast and break things. There's a risk that can happen in Europe, but Europe actually has a big opportunity to forge a different path ahead. And in order to do that, it needs to be building in a thoughtful way. So for example, supporting small SMEs to ensure a diverse and competitive digital market, centering interoperability and open source as core design principles, ensuring there's multi-stakeholder governance and democratic oversight to ensure that new tech or new infrastructures remain fully aligned with the public interest. And crucially, building thoughtfully means ensuring fundamental rights, environmental safeguards, and consumer protections play a central role in Europe's technological future. And again, this is backed up by polling. Big majorities in France, Germany, and Spain has said in the polling that they prefer to use Europe-based alternatives to what's available in the US, with only 5% of people polled favoring US providers. So there is certainly an appetite there from European citizens. So to end, it will not just take regulation, it will not just take innovation, it will not just take competition. There needs to be a sort of smart mix of solutions for Europe to pave the way for a technological future that puts people, planet, and democracy first. And I will end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rasha. So, since here we want to work that everybody understand what's going on, so before question, just if someone wants some precision to understand better some part of what she's presenting, please just ask. What I want to say is that the goals that we are pursuing together is, she speaks about interoperability. We will have in the afternoon a section on interoperability and also another section on artificial intelligence. But for the one that maybe doesn't know what we mean by interoperability is the fact that when you use a tool, a digital tool or a digital infrastructure, that you are not prisoner of this digital infrastructure, that your work, your data, you are sovereign, you have it, and you can bring it somewhere else. This is what is interoperability we mean, but we will talk about this because it's really important. This afternoon we will talk about how we use the data in the social services in Catalonia and how the government is doing a politics around that, if this is good or bad. Then also, of course, we talk about the profiling people, using our data to profile the people. The big tech, they live, as you say, most of the product they give are for free. So their business is on our data, and this means that our data are sold for politics, are sold for economy, and our private lives is destroyed, and we are followable everywhere we go, anything we do. And the other important things that we defend, as Rasha was saying, is that not only the big player can play in the future of economy, which is the digital economy, but that we prepare a ground so that we can all, civil society, small and medium enterprise, freelancer, autonomous, everybody can grow on this and contribute to a fair internet and a fair digital future. So, do you have any question for Rasha? Yeah, I'm sure, yes.
Sí, val, doncs preguntaré en català. Bàsicament, respecte a lo de trencar les grans empreses i corporacions, al cas de Google hi havia la problemàtica de que si feien, per exemple, que Google hagués de vendre el navegador Chrome, que actualment em sembla que té com el 90% d'usuaris.
If she does it in Spanish, you would understand? Or you prefer an English translation?
Let's try Spanish, let me see, and then I'll ask you if I need help.
No t'importa fer-ho en castellà, perquè castellà sí que entén i així no he de traduir i anem més fluids.
Val, molt bé, cap problema. Pues que respecto al tema de romper las grandes empresas americanas como Google, había el problema cuando el caso de Google, que los navegadores, el navegador Chrome tiene el 90% del mercado y Firefox el 10%. Entonces había el riesgo de que si forzaban a Google a vender Chrome, Google dejase de pagar para Firefox, porque hay un contrato de anuncio que les dan varios millones, que es lo que permite que Firefox esté en funcionamiento. Entonces, estos riesgos que son estructurales, no veo cómo desde la ley se pueden solucionar. Y tampoco desde la Unión Europea no creo que haya una posibilidad de hacer algo hacer un tercer navegador que pueda hacer frente a la problemática que supone pues el navegador Chrome, ¿no? Que a través de sus tecnologías y de saltarse las especificaciones pues de HTML, de CSS, de todos los lenguajes de programación que hay detrás, a base de ampliarlos, pues fuerzan que las páginas web tengan que funcionar con Chrome, ¿no? Entonces, cuando los programadores y pequeñas empresas crean un servicio, lo hacen básicamente para Chrome, y si con Firefox funciona, pues bien, y si no, pues ya poco a poco irán arreglando las cosas. Entonces, no sé si hay algún tipo de... Bueno, cuál es su perspectiva y si hay un tipo de programa en la Unión Europea para esto, pero vamos, parece como bastante solidificado el problema este.
Can we grab some more? Can we get some more? ¿Hay otras preguntas? Para ir más rápido, recogemos algunas. Sí.
Sí, será Rasha, hola. Gracias por la presentación. Yo solo quería saber si hay alguna iniciativa en marcha de la Unión Europea sobre la infraestructura digital pública. No sé si hay algún movimiento en ese sentido. Gracias.
Hola, Rasha. Mi pregunta es en torno a la confianza que podamos tener acerca de las motivaciones de la Unión Europea cuando regula. Porque a mí mi preocupación normalmente, y no lo digo desde un punto de vista capitalista anarquista, ¿no? Libertario anarquista, no. Lo digo desde el punto de vista de que siempre me da miedo cuando se establecen leyes de control para poder acabar con fake news, etcétera, que al final se acaban utilizando exactamente para atacarnos a los demás en vez de para su propósito inicial. Y el ejemplo sería la ley en España, las leyes contra los discursos de odio, que al final se están utilizando por los grupos de extrema derecha para atacar precisamente a los antifascistas, a los antirracistas, etcétera. Entonces, ese tipo lo que querría es que nos explicaras cómo podemos intentar protegernos ante esa usurpación de leyes en principio benignas que acaban atacándonos a nosotros.
Agafem una última i després ja allà. Podeu fer passar el micro, sisplau?
Hola, Rasha. Una pregunta sobre los derechos digitales, ¿no?, en la Unión Europea. En la relación que hay entre estas iniciativas legislativas, ¿no?, de la DMA, DSA, todo esto, o la ley de la IA, pero luego no solo con las empresas, ¿no?, a las que afectan estas leyes, sino otras iniciativas que tiene la Unión Europea en marcha, como por ejemplo lo que ha ido saliendo de chat control, esta dualidad de la Unión Europea, ¿no?, de legislar sobre algunos derechos, pero luego tiene otras iniciativas que un poco también restringen estos derechos. Entonces, la relación entre estos dos temas.
Perfecte, molt completes les preguntes, very full questions, so if you can solve all this, Rasha, we will be grateful.
I will try. And I'm sorry not to answer in Spanish. I could try, but you'll probably hear a mixture of words that don't make sense. So I'll stick to English. So yeah, the first question about Google Chrome, that's a really interesting question, and it's actually something that came up while I was at People versus Big Tech and sort of working on a campaign calling on the Commission to break up Google. And so we spoke to several players, and you're absolutely right that Firefox is dependent on this payment from Google. But I think one thing that there are many things that the dominance of US big tech companies has done to us, but I think one of the major things is it's kind of restricted our imagination a bit, and it's sort of made us think that the way that they do business and the way that their platforms work is the only way, and it's not. So just to give a very a quick example, so I don't know whether people saw that around the time that the US case was happening, and people were talking about what kind of remedies could be imposed on Google. Firefox did put out put out like articles or statements, talking about the fact that if the breakup did happen, then that would basically crush Firefox as a browser, because it's so financially dependent on the payment that it gets from Google. However, I think there was also this might have been sort of rumors, but I was hearing in some places as well that if Google was forced to divest from Chrome, that Firefox would, you know, I think Firefox and there were others who were sort of looking to buy Chrome. And you know, I know that Firefox itself, I don't want to speak on behalf of Firefox because you know, I'm not a Firefox representative, but I do know through, you know, discussions and through statements that they put out that they were already looking to sort of diversify their funding streams. And I think this is a lesson for all of smaller companies that, you know, that there's a fundamental issue, which is that there's such a huge dependent on big US big tech companies and on core infrastructure that is you know, provided by US tech companies, that it's no wonder that Europe is in the position that it's in, frankly. And you know, smaller companies have to sort of think about diversifying their funding streams and looking sort of to other ways to make sure that they're not kind of caught in this trap, right? That, you know, you have to be beholden to Google, otherwise your business is gonna fail. So there's, you know, I think that kind of reinforces the fact that there is a fundamental market failure that should have been addressed years ago. And had it been addressed, then, you know, perhaps, you know, smaller businesses or smaller browsers like Firefox wouldn't be in the position that they're in. And I think there are obviously very complex market factors, other market factors that are at play and that need to be corrected. But I think the first step is really taking, you know, I was going to say radical action, but it's not radical. It's basically enforcing the DMA, and you know, I think it is a shame that the Commission didn't you know, didn't impose structural remedies on Google this time round, but I think they're still looking at kind of what other things to do. But yeah, all of that to say that there are obviously other complex issues at play, but I think we can be creative in the way that we address those. And it's also very important again to make sure that this kind of dependence and reliance on US big tech companies is something that becomes resolved soon. And I think there was a question about digital public infrastructure initiatives around digital public infrastructure in the EU. So this is something that I know less about, so, and I know that's going to be covered later, but I do know that there is a digital tech sorry, it's called a Democratic Tech Alliance. There's this initiative in the EU that's led by a bunch of MEPs, and the idea is to push forward a kind of an ambitious agenda for a European tech ecosystem that allows Europe to become, you know, this independent tech sovereign region. But I haven't been involved in that recently, but maybe Simona, you have more information.
Yeah, on that we will talk on the next panel, so don't worry. So if you can say, yeah.
All right, I'll talk about the rest of I'll try and tackle the rest of the questions. So yeah, one, I guess I guess the last three questions were sort of related. So, you know, the risk of EU regulations that are supposed to be curbing the power of big tech companies and being used to censor us, or, you know, laws in Spain for hate speech that are being weaponized against anti-racist campaigners, and, you know, how do we protect ourselves from that? I mean, we're seeing this in the UK, right, as well, with so-called terrorist laws being applied to campaign groups that are campaigning against the genocide, like Palestine Action, for example. And I think a big part of ensuring that these kinds of laws are not abused is one, you know, of course, fighting back against them and you know, calling out this sort of abuse of power when it happens. And you know, within the, just thinking specifically about the DSA, it was designed in a way that would not encroach on content moderation decisions. So you know, it talks about risk assessments and it focuses on illegal content, and it rather than sort of policing speech, it focuses on making sure that content moderation practices are transparent and that there's, you know, an opportunity to appeal, etc., etc. And now, actually, in the case that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation around Meta, one of the examples that was highlighted around Meta's failure to be transparent around content moderation was actually its censorship of pro-Palestinian voices and of Palestinian content. And so I think accountability is really important, and I know accountability is a big word and can also can be meaningless in many instances. But I think that allowing tech companies, or whoever it may be, tech companies or states, to persistently break the law and to not be held accountable, it only makes their behavior worse as time goes on, because they feel like, I'm not going to feel any consequences for this, and so, you know, I can just continue to behave badly. So I think you know, making sure that we're submitting DSA complaints, making sure that we're using strategic litigation as a tool to fight back against this, is all really, really important, because it's a very slippery slope. And I think if the more we allow this to happen, the worse the sort of censorship and oppression will get.
Thank you very much, Rasha. I think what you just last said, it worked also for the chat control question. So we cannot allow our government to work against us. So we have to fight. This is why we try to get organized on that. The time is over, I'm afraid. So Rasha, thank you very much. If you want to know more about Rasha, we just published yesterday an interview on our work and on our research about how technology is used during the extermination of the Palestinian work. You can find it in Contexto. Is published an interview on her, and we can follow her work. She's very active. She's really present in the internet. So thank you very much, Rasha, for your time, and see you next. Ciao, ciao. Thank you.